Welcome to the first episode of a new mini-series here on the podcast, The Reception of the Zohar, A History. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This 5-part series on the podcast will explore the reception history of the Zohar. The aim of the series is to explore this topic and the literature and controversies surrounding the topic throughout the centuries. And you'll hear more about this at the beginning of episode 1. Episode 1 begins with a short overview of the Zohar and proceeds to discuss the early reception history of the Zohar beginning in the 13th century and proceeding until the early modern period, and that's where episode 2 will pick up. The 5-part series will air over the next 2 weeks, although there will be other episodes as well. There's a new auction chatter for the upcoming Gnazim 20 auction, so stay tuned for that. This episode of the series is sponsored anonymously. To sponsor an episode, you can email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, or check out the links and information in the show's notes. Additionally, you can find the link in the show's notes to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new Svarim, new books, book deals, and so on. If you can also please subscribe and rate and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen, whether Apple, Spotify, 24/6, or elsewhere. I appreciate it. And finally, enjoy this first episode of the series. I look forward to hearing from listeners what they think of this. And again, stay tuned for episode 2 later this week. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast and the first episode of a new mini-series here on the podcast, The Reception of the Zohar, A History. And I'm going to be joined on this mini-series for all the episodes of the mini-series by Kimche, who is a PhD student candidate at Harvard University, who has his own podcast, and he's joined the podcast in the past as well. We discussed Christian David Ginsburg. But for this mini-series, again, we're going to be focusing on the Zohar. Thank you, JJ, for joining me again.
It's a pleasure, Nachi. Looking forward.
So before we start off, I want to just give a little bit of introduction. JJ, I know you want to as well, so after I give an introduction here, which is that I know the Zohar is this topic specifically about the Zohar is a kind of a complicated topic, and I just want to be clear about what we're doing here on the podcast and what we're not doing on the podcast. So as stated, the title of the mini-series, which is The Reception of the Zohar History, is exactly what the series is trying to do. The reception of the Zohar. So right away when the Zohar was revealed or came to be known, and we'll talk more about that in the 13th century. Right away, there were detractors. There were comments made. It's not Rishon Breichai, or Rashbi will call him. It's not him. It is him. And so we're going to get into that. That's especially going to be the focus of this first episode here. But overwhelmingly today in the frum world, it's accepted as Rishon Breichai. And in the academic world, it's accepted that it's not Rishon Breichai, and it's Ramesh DeLeon, or it's not Ramesh DeLeon. It's a circle of Kabbalists or some others, etc. This podcast series and this podcast is not trying to make a claim one way or the other. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to engage in the historical question, or the historical conversation and the history that came about around the Zohar. There's been countless Svarim written about it. There's back and forth, those pro, anti, if you will, defending it. And we're going to get involved in many of those figures that it starts off in the Sefer Yochzer B'Schut Menakoi, and we're going to get involved with many of Yudari Modena, and then there's obviously those defensive, and Yaakov Emden famously Matachas Farim. We're going to go through many others. Obviously Ramchal has a Sefer, and then there's Rav David Luria, basically has a cover, and there's many more, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot that we're going to get into much more. And of course, as listeners are aware, and it's something we'll discuss, you obviously have the Zohar is quoted in the Halacha. It's brought down extensively, the Beis of Karo, and you have the Magen Avram and many others. And this is something, obviously, Reb Chaim Arizal and Reb Chaim Vital. So this is something that's very accepted, very discussed, especially today with Chassidus, big part of Chassidus. So the point in this long-winded introduction I'm trying to make is that we are here to engage in the conversation around the history, and especially the reception history of the Zohar, and to bring that to listeners.
Yes, indeed we are, Nachi. So firstly, thank you for having me on. I'm very excited about this mini-series that we're going to do for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because the question of the authorship of the Zohar, its antiquity, its authority, its legitimacy, is an important question. It actually goes to the heart of many people's practice of Judaism, their beliefs of Judaism, the way they understand what the contours of Judaism is. So it is a relevant and important question for everyone to at least think about or know about the controversy, the first reason. And the second and main reason why we're doing this, the reason I'm excited for this, is that there is an amazing cast of characters that we're going to meet over the next few episodes. In other words, the debate over when the Zohar was written, by whom it was written, what it contains, how legitimate is it. This is something that's been debated by some of the most fascinating figures of the last 700 years in the history of Jewish thought. Some of them, like Rav Yaakov Emden, etc., very well known, very familiar to many, and others who are not, who actually only flutter around the very edges of the consciousness of the average well-educated Jew. And therefore, I'm excited to introduce people to them. I'm excited to introduce people to this debate, and we're going to have a cracking time over the coming few episodes. Now, a few points to bear. Firstly, as you said, yes, our plan here is not to take sides or is not to try and make the case pro or anti the Zohar. I've done that elsewhere. That's not really what I intend to do. I intend to approach this as a historian of ideas, and really bring everyone who's listening to this through the quite wonderful and extraordinary history of the reception of the Zohar over the last few decades. Last few centuries. And also, an important point to make is that there's no way, really, certainly not in the 5 episodes that we have planned, to cover the entire thing. Right? We're talking about hundreds of years, dozens of books, thousands of pages, an infinite amount of sources, etc. And therefore, it is important to know that we are going to be doing, I suppose, the main highlights here, and I will be dropping over the course of this of these episodes. I'll be dropping mentions of, let's say, honorable mentions. Right? I'll say, oh, such a person wrote a book, but we don't really have time to get in there, or there is this claim, we don't really have time to go into it. Some parts will be a little bit technical, but on the whole, it's going to be a fascinating journey. Now, before we begin, we need a few introductions to set the scene and to understand what it is we're doing. The very first introduction I'm going to make is on the nature of history itself and the study of history itself. And with this, there needs to be actually an important semantic caveat here. And the one that I mean is the difference between history and history. Okay, or history with a capital H and history with a lowercase h. And basically, what I mean to say is that there are 3 important ways in which we use the word history, and depending on how you're using that word will often depend on what you think you're doing when you're analyzing history or trying to construct a history or studying history, etc. So, firstly, is the word history is often used by people to mean the sum total of events that happened, right? So, for example, he is the fastest man in history, or this is the first time in history that such and such a thing happens. What does that mean? It means it's the first time in the course of all events in human history, or all, let's say, the first time in Jewish history. This means in the course of all the sum total of events in Jewish history, this is the first time it's happened. So that's one way people use the word history. History is also meant as an academic discipline, right? Which is the attempt to reconstruct the past, to attempt to reconstruct what happened in the distant past based on the available evidence that there is, right? So, for example, I will say, my PhD is in the field of history, okay? What does that mean? It means that I am studying a certain academic discipline. That discipline has rules, it has presumptions, it has, processes and procedures, the way that one does history. And the way one does history is one studies what there is, meaning you study texts, you study archaeological findings, you study artifacts that have been left over, whatever it is, but you reconstruct the past based on what there is, not on what there isn't. Okay. And the third way that one generally uses the word history is when one references an example of trying to reconstruct the history. So, for example, Paul Johnson's famous A History of the Jews. What does that mean? It means it is one attempt to capture in one book the meaning of the word, one attempt to paint a portrait of history, specifically the history of the Jews in this case, and that is also what we mean in history. So we have capital H history, which is the sum total of what took place in the past. We have lowercase h history, which means the academic discipline that tries to reconstruct that past based on the evidence, and we have history in the sense of a specific example of that attempt to recapture the past. Now, the point, why did I bring all this up? Because there are some topics, in fact, many topics, which may or may not have had a large imprint in capital H history, i.e., the sum total of what happened in the past, but didn't leave behind enough evidence, or didn't leave us here in the 21st century enough to really study it, or to make satisfactory declarations of what happened in that history. Okay, so for example, there are many civilizations, or many people, or many cities or battles, or choose whatever historical event you want, which didn't necessarily leave behind a great deal of evidence, and therefore us who study lowercase h history might say, listen, such an event, such a person, such a civilization might have had a great effect in history, but we as historians can't necessarily study it because we don't have what to base ideas on. We can only, guess or make educated hypotheses. We can't actually say much about it because we are engaging in trying to reconstruct capital H history. We are engaging in lowercase a history, in other words, the study of the evidence of what there is. Now, this is especially important when trying to study our subject today, which is about mysticism, which is about Kabbalah, which is about the Zohar, because this difference in history and history is at the very, very crux of much of the debate. In other words, for many, the esoteric study or the study of something which is supposed to be kept a secret is a very difficult thing for the historian. Because as I said before, lowercase h history goes off of the evidence of what there is, of what people have left behind, of what people have written, of what we have today that used to exist back then. And the problem, of course, with something like an esoteric or a secret tradition is that by design, it tends to leave very little behind. So therefore, what I'm saying today is that we are going to go through the reception history, lowercase h history of the Zohar. We are going to try and talk about the history of Jewish mysticism, with the caveat that not everything that occurs in capital H history, not everything that happens in the sum total of events of the past is available to us today. Not everything exists for historians today. Not all the evidence is in, and therefore what we are going to say is based on the best reconstruction we can do, but no more than that. Because we are mere historians. We don't have access to everything in the past. We only have access to what there is. Okay, that's sort of, I want to sort of add that as a health warning beforehand. I also wanted to, so before we get onto the Zohar controversy, there's also a necessity a little bit of clarifying a couple terms of Kabbalah and also giving a brief history of what I mean by what we mean by the Zohar, what the Zohar is, what you'll see when opening the book, and then we can get onto the controversy itself. So, the first thing I would say is the necessity of drawing the difference, the distinction that's not always drawn, especially in the From world, between Kabbalah and mysticism in general, mysticism writ large. Because mysticism, which is actually quite a difficult term to satisfactorily define, but mysticism is common to many religions, right? And especially religions which posit the idea of a God that is essentially beyond our rational conceptions, a God that is fundamentally indescribable, fundamentally beyond any of the tools that human beings usually use to characterize and conceptualize their reality. The God that we serve, the God that exists, lies beyond all of that, and therefore many in the past have used or have attempted to gain access, let's say, to the divine realm through instinctual and symbolic and allegoristic, metaphoric ways of trying to reach deeper truths that are not necessarily open to our rational minds. Okay, and this is, again, a very poor definition, but basically the mystical instinct is common certainly to many religions, certainly to Judaism from the very earliest text. Now, you see in all the strata, all the various layers of Jewish text from the beginning of history, you see elements of mysticism. So, for example, in the Tanakh, you have the first chapter of Yechezkel, Ma'aseh Merkava, and other such things. When it comes to the Mishnah, you have the Mishnah in Chagiga, which warns against asking Mala Mala, Mala Mata, Ma Bifnim, Ma Me'achar. You have various midrashim, which seem to be very mystical, difficult to exactly understand what is going on, talking in kind of allegorical, mystical hints. You have the Hechalot literature. You have in the Gemara, you have, for example, the famous narrative of the Arba Nichnasu Pardes, and only Rabbi Akiva Nichnas b'Shalom Yatza b'Shalom. Right. So you have many different elements or texts or hints, as it were, to this kind of realm of activity, realm of ideas, which can properly be characterized as mysticism. Okay, and that's to be expected. And many of these texts remain as they are, as mere hints. It is very difficult to get a deeper understanding of what is going on here. However, when it comes to what we're characterizing as Kabbalah, so Kabbalah literally just means reception or a set of received ideas. This has a very specific, very definite history and came up at a very specific and definite time in Jewish history. Okay, and that time was something like the middle to the end of the 12th century. Okay, this is the time when Rambam lived, and during that time we see in the south of France, in the Provençal region, surrounding the circle specifically of the Ra'avad, the famous glosser of Rambam's Mishneh Torah, of Ram ben David, and his circles, and his son Yisagi Nahor and others, and we see the beginnings, the first written evidence, the first texts being produced, which can properly be called Kabbalistic in the sense that they center around a set of themes and use a set of hermeneutical techniques, which can properly be characterized as Kabbalistic. So you have that in the south of France, and then into the 13th century, it crosses the Pyrenees and goes into Spain, into the regions of Girona and Castile. And so what you have in the 12th and 13th century is a rise of a very specific set of thinkers who talk about certain ideas and who have a set of concerns and who write in a specific way. And these can probably be characterized as Kabbalistic. In opposition, let's say, for example, to the Hasidei Ashkenaz, who were also mystics in Germany and France, but they wrote differently. They had different sets of concerns. They had different ways of reading texts, etc., and therefore can't necessarily be characterized as Kabbalists, even though they were mystics specifically. Now, in the late 1200s, between about 1280 and 1296 or 1300, roughly, there arose a set of texts that started to be written down and started to be circulated. Now, the person who seems to have been writing this down and circulating them was a Kabbalist from Castile called Moshe de Leon, known by some other things that he wrote. He was a Kabbalist, but he kept the company of many other Kabbalists in the area of Castile at the time, such as Yosef Kikatila and Todros Abulafia and others. And essentially, he began to write down sets of various texts which began to circulate as pamphlets in and among Kabbalists in Spain and eventually into Eretz Israel. And those texts eventually, centuries later, got sewn together, put together at the time of the printing and published as Sefer HaZohar, or the book of the Zohar. Even though, of course, as I'm about to explain in a moment, the Zohar is not really a book at all. It is actually a set of texts, a library, an anthology of texts, which later on got put together. Now, a brief word about this, which is that the Zohar, among other things, contains over 20 or so different textual compilations. Some of them are printed side by side, some of them are printed all together. And so the main one is what is often known as Midrash HaZohar, sometimes called in modern day Hebrew Guf HaZohar, the main body of the Zohar. And that is recognizable as a medieval Midrash. Okay, basically, you'll have one of the members of the mystical circle, the Chevraya, open, Rabbi Chia Patach or Rabbi Lazar Patach. They will begin by some sort of homily, mystical homily, and they will continue to discuss it. And it functions as a kind of medieval mystical midrash al Torah. And then there are various other elements of the Zohar, various other smaller and different textual compilations, and each of them involve this group of mystics, right? This group of mystics, which is led by and centered around Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, famous 2nd century sage, living in the lands of Israel in the time of the Roman persecution, and essentially his son Elazar and a group of other rabbis, some of whom lived in his time, some of whom, according to the Talmudic text, lived much later. And basically, the Zohar is, for lack of better words, the adventures of this group. Some of these adventures are intellectual adventures, some of these are mystical adventures, and some of these are literal physical adventures where they walk around or they'll go on a journey and then they'll meet, an old man, the Sabbat Mishpatim, who will teach them all sorts of mystical secrets. And then, another time they'll meet a young boy, the Yanuka, which is another text within the Zohar, and they'll have a whole set of Kabbalistic discourses with him. And essentially it is the Zohar can be characterized as the intellectual and mystical, spiritual, and physical adventures of this mystical group, of this Tevraya, this set of Kabbalists, centered around the central figure of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a Tana who lived in the 2nd century of the Galil. This is, and you have various other elements of the Zohar as well, the Raya Mehemna, the Zohar Chadash, the Tikkunei Zohar, which seem to have been appended after its final completion. But that is essentially what you will get upon opening the Zohar. And it's, of course, written in Aramaic, and it has these mystical discussions or midrashic readings of text that go off on all kinds of tangents, something like what one might be used to in the Talmud or other such texts. Nachi, you want to add in something?
Yeah, so I just want to jump in. Thank you for that introduction, lengthy introduction. We have some other introductions that I want to ask you, introduction material. But when you mentioned Ramesh Leon writing it down, as we're going to get to, that's where the controversy, if you will, becomes, because you don't mean to say that Ramesh Leon wrote the Zohar. I mean, some say, we're going to get to, especially the testimony in the Yuchsin of Rabbi Yosef Menaka, who's saying that Ramesh Leon himself wrote it. It wasn't Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But obviously, there are many who say, no, it was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but that's how it became revealed. When you say write it down, just to clarify listeners, doesn't necessarily mean, as we're saying in the history, that he wrote it. It's he wrote it down and actually was writing these manuscripts that were coming out and being spread about.
Okay, let me clarify. L'chola Alma, that Moshe Leon was the first person to write the texts of the Zohar that began to be distributed among the Kabbalists. Okay, the first time it was put pen to paper in such a fashion that people were reading it in Spain and quickly in Italy and Eretz Israel and other such places, and it began to be accepted by certain figures in those places. That was seemingly largely of Moshe de Leon, although others as well. And actually, it's going to get much more complicated than that, as we'll see when we get to the era of printing. But yes, in terms of that form of authorship, everyone agrees that Moshe de Leon was the first person to circulate it in that manner. Now, of course, with the circulation of the earliest text of the Zohar, already in the early years, the first few years the Zohar was being circulated, it was accompanied by a tradition. And that tradition was that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his disciples that are mentioned therein, they are not only the figures of the Zohar, they're not only the central protagonists, they're also the authors, that it was in fact written during that time, and that it was passed down either mouth to mouth, or it was passed down in secret manuscripts that were later copied by Rabbi Moshe de Leon, but essentially that was written then. Now some, as we're going to get there in a moment, some people immediately believed this and ascribed this text to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and some didn't. Some Kabbalists at the time thought, okay, no, we understand who the narrative, who the protagonists are, but others, but ultimately this is the fruit of the pen of Moshe de Leon, who lived in late 1200 Spain and died in 1305 there. Yeah, so I think that's important. The final, I suppose, little introductory point that I would make, which is a little bit necessary, is to say a word about the central mystical motif of the Zohar, which is the SS Sfirot, right? The 10 Sfirot. Now, this is obviously a topic which can be studied for months, for years. Very difficult to do it justice in 2 minutes. But essentially, this is the major idea, the center of the Zohar, the major theological innovation, let's say, the center of the Zohar. And because of this, those who objected to the Zohar would often attack, in one way or other, the idea of the SS Sfirot, and that's why it's important to talk about it, because it'll come up in the next 5 episodes, and we have to have a slight background of it. Now, it's difficult to give an introduction to the SS Sfirot, but I will say as follows. Many religious thinkers in the medieval period, including Kabbalists, including philosophers, including Christians and Jews, many, had a set of issues regarding the theological speculations, right? The set of problems. One of the major problems was how to bridge the gap between the God that seemed to be demanded by philosophy and the God that is known through religious traditions. What I mean is that if you read the more philosophically inclined thinkers of the medieval period, following Aristotle and others, they, and Rambam certainly and others, portray God as this distant, infinite, transcendent, illimitable, indescribable being, right? A being that is, one can't even say anything particularly about it. It is utterly beyond our conception. It is absolutely perfect. It is something that can barely be described, let alone have any kind of relationship with. That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, of course, the main religious traditions of all of these traditions, and certainly of the Tanakh, is that God is also intimately involved in our lives. He is, a father and a king, and gives us rules and punishes us and loves us and all these sorts of things. And how do you square that circle? How is God both absolutely impenetrable, indescribable, and distant, and also at the same time absolutely close, absolutely with us at all points and all times? Okay. Similar issue, a similar sort of tension within medieval theology is the problem of God being absolutely perfectly unified, perfectly good, perfectly existing as perfect as a being could be on the one hand, and his creation, namely this world, being so depraved and so there's so much evil, and there's so much loss, and there's so much lacking in the world. And how do we get from one to the other? How do you get from perfect unity and perfection to multiplicity, to a world in which it seems is so distant from the ideal of godly perfection, right? And this is a set, and there are many other similar such issues at the heart of medieval theology. And the way that the Mekubalim, the way the Kabbalists sought to tackle this, is to essentially introduce a duality, a two-sided understanding of what the divine is, of what God is. And one element of it is what they call the Ein Sof. The Ein Sof meaning what I described before, the absolute transcendent, the absolute indescribable being that no human mind or language or consciousness could possibly penetrate. And that is the highest notion of the divine, essentially. That is called the Ein Sof, or sometimes called Ayin, as in Aleph Yud Nun, Ayin, nothingness, non-being. That is the one side, and that is the one aspect of divinity. On the other side, there is a revealed aspect of divinity, and how the Kabbalists, and certainly by the time of the Zohar, because of course there is an intellectual process in the development of the idea of the Sefirot, but essentially there's a revealed aspect of divinity which resembles a 10-stage process. A 10-stage process of divine self-revelation or self-actualization, the coming into being of the fullness of the divine. And that begins with the top Sefirah called Keter, right? The top, and then Chachma, Bina, etc., and goes down all the way to the last Sefirah of Malchut, which is also identified as the female Shekhinah. And essentially that this element of the divine is what we can understand, we can grasp this divine ecosystem, as it were. In other words, it's not a perfect unity, it's rather a 10-stage ecosystem in which these 10 divine forces or powers or 10 midot, 10 divine aspects, they have an interplay with each other, and they have a delicate balance within each other. And basically, these Sefirot are what is being described in the Tanakh. They are what human beings can attempt to have a relationship with. And by doing good deeds or by doing bad deeds, human beings can actually affect this 10-part structure, divine structure of divinity, can affect it positively, negatively, etc. But essentially, this idea of divinity itself being comprised of a 10-staged map or blueprint called the Sefirot, that is the theological motif at the very heart of the Zohar. And this gets Kabbalists into a world of trouble, at least by their criticizers, which we will see in due course. So we have the Zohar, we have the Sefirot, and this is, again, because of course there's enormous literature behind all of these concepts, but basically you have this book or this set of texts begin to be circulating, containing to a large degree this idea which already had prefigurations in the Sefer HaBahir and the writings of some of the other Kabbalists in the 12th, 13th century. And this is what begins to circulate, and this starts to gain the admiration of some and the ire of others. And this essentially is the story that we're going to be telling over the coming episodes.
Yeah, and absolutely. This is not a Kabbalah podcast. There's much more to talk about in the Spheres. This is just to give a very small description. I'm sure even the Spheres, there's others that can disagree with you and have different explanations for it. But just to give a brief overview, there's that. Now, before we dive into the question of the Zohar and it being revealed and the authorship, etc., I do want you mentioned briefly about the different parts of the Zohar. But if you'll just give a little bit more of a explanation of what comes to be the Zohar. Of course, like you're saying, we're going to talk about in the beginning where it would come out little contrasted, little piece by piece. We're talking in the mid-13th century, the era before print, well before print. So it's not published. The Zohar is not published until the middle of the 16th century, 300 years later. But at least in the beginning, to talk about the different parts of the Zohar, even though some of it's going to be further, we're going to talk about things that come back further. But to give the listener that's listening to this, that's familiar a little with the Zohar or not familiar, when they hear about the Zohar, there's the Zohar Chodesh, the Raya Mehemna, the Tikkun Zohar, what are they hearing of? What are the different parts? Medrash and Elam, what's going on? Give them a little bit of a bearings where they can get their bearings, and then we'll proceed and to start with the beginning of it being revealed in the authorship.
I mean, I think you've said a vast portion of what needs to be said about it for the purpose of this podcast, and I certainly encourage everyone to go look this up. There are very good explanations. For example, Gershom Shalom's book, the Major Trends of Jewish Mysticism, has a whole chapter on the doctrines of the Zohar and different parts of the Zohar. But as I said, essentially this. But because the circle, Rishon Bar Yochai and his disciples, because they are doing different things and discussing different things, so each of them, so some of it is included in the main section, the Guf HaZohar, but some of it is, as I mentioned before, for example, there are two idrot, right? Two assemblies or convocations. One of them is called the Idrot Rabbah, the Great Assembly, the Idrot Zuz, the Small Assembly. And each of those, the Rishon Bar Yochai gathers his disciples together in order to discuss some things. The Idrot Rabbah, they discuss certain things, and Idrot Zuz is actually the sort of the death scene of Rishon Bar Yochai, where he gives his final instructions to the disciples. So each of them has, and of course, as Zohar scholarship has gone on, we're going to get to a bit later. So many have identified different hands or different styles or different sort of subtly different theologies within some of these different texts. But again, this brings us a little bit too far. Well, the point is that this idea of there being different parts of the Zohar is important for the development of Zohar history, because some have claimed, in other words, I presented two positions earlier, right? One, that it is written by Rishon Bar Yochai, and the other one is written by Moshe de Leon. However, there are some, as we'll see in the coming episodes, who try and propose various kinds of middle positions, including that some parts of the Zohar are more authentic, some parts are less authentic. The Raya Mehemna is later, Tikkun Zohar, Zohar Chadash, etc. All of these elements, and basically draw distinctions between the parts. That's why it's actually important for our purposes. But to go into the ins and outs of each particular part, I will leave for the discerning viewers to go do their own research, because that would take several episodes in and of itself.
Yeah, I just meant to a brief overview, and I'm looking also, I have the Hamor has a Zera Mavur, and they have in the first volume, there's a large introduction, they talk about, so there's a Sefer Zera, but you mentioned the Gufa Zera, there's the Raya Mehemna, extra Drushim, and as you mentioned, some say it's later. I mean, just to say right away, the Zera Chai, we'll talk about Kamarna says maybe it's later. I mean, it's Yaakov Emden's going to say different parts, so this is not, we're going to get into it, we're going to talk about different parts, and there's the Saba de Meshpatim, Safra de Tzniusa, Ijoraba, Idrizuta, there's the Tikkune Zayar, which are not really corrections, we should say, tikkunim. It's like extra parts of the Zohar, and then the Zohar Chadash, which comes about later. So those are the basics, different parts. And as you mentioned, there's the other Sefer Kabbalah. You already mentioned the Bayer and the Sefer Yetzirah, and there's other things like that. Okay, so that's really kind of just giving the very quick thumbnail sketch, as you're saying. And I really should mention here, the whole series is really going to be that, because even though we're going to do a few-part mini-series, we're going to talk about different things. Obviously, Yaakov Emden has a whole Sefer, Matbach Asfarim, comments on the Zohar, and Ramesh Kunitz, you mentioned we're going to meet cast of characters, and some known, some not well known. Ramesh Kunitz probably not well known, not that well known. He's a massive book, Ben Yechai, where he's defending the Sefer Zohar, being Rashbi, against Rabbi Yaakov Emden, and he goes to, we're not going to get extensively the extensive comments that he makes, and then we know Shir, so the Rabbi Board comes back against him, and so there's just a lot going on back and forth. We're not going to get into all the nitty gritty of everything. We'll highlight some examples, talk about some of these works, talk about some of these authors, and we'll get into it. So yes, I think in the beginning, it's worthwhile to start off from the beginning, from the first, in the beginning of the Zohar, if you will, of at least when it becomes revealed, and when we first hear about the Zohar, as you say, not necessarily even as a book, but as something, the Zohar. And by the way, there's various different names that's even known that you look at the Rishonim that are quoting it in the beginning early on. It's not even necessarily called the Zohar. You have Medrash Rashbi, Mechilta Rashbi, and many different names that are going on, and we can get into that as well. So let's start there at the beginning.
Okay, so as mentioned before, these writings begin to circulate, certainly as you say, it's Kuntrasim, and begin to circulate among circles of Kabbalists. And actually, for the first few hundred years of the life of the Zohar, firstly, they don't become a book, but also they don't really burst into the popular imagination too much. Okay, so they circle among Kabbalists in Spain, and some and to Italy and to Eretz Israel. And you have actually quite quickly some who do incorporate some of it into their Pirushim. So, for example, famously Menachem Recanati in Italy and others. However, we do have also in those early decades the first instance, or the first direct historical evidence that we have of what one might call Zohar skepticism, or an account of whether or not, wondering and trying to investigate the true provenance of the Sefer Zohar. And this was by a Kabbalist who lived in Eretz Israel in the late 1200s, a man called Isaac of Akko, Yitzchak Demin Akko. And he writes in his diary. Now, this diary was transcribed and put into the first edition of the Sefer Yuchasin, which was put together by an extraordinary astronomer and philosopher called Avram Zakuto in the early 1500s. But he transcribes this diary entry or this journal entry by Yitzchak Demin Akko, which says as follows, and it's a very interesting piece of historical evidence. We're going on to discuss this.
And by the way, I just want to jump in. So this is printed in the first edition of the Sefer Yochsin, I think in 1566. If I'm getting the years right, or that's the censored one.
It's the censored one. Censored one.
That's the censored one. It's printed in the first edition of Sefer Yochsin,
early 1500s.
Then it's censored out, and now in the it's printed in full. I know you definitely can read it in the Mishnah Sazar, which is in Hebrew, and there's also an English edition by Shai Tishby, and it's printed in there. You can read it in the original. So, nowadays you can get scans of the original. So yes.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get that. So what does Yitzchak Demin Akko says? He says that in Eretz Israel he received copies of this new work, and along with reading it and seeing who the cast of characters were, there was this, as I said, this tradition. This was actually written by Rishon Bar Yochai, not just describing sayings and doings of him in his circle, was actually written by them over 1,000 years earlier. And he decided, and of course, we should probably pause to explain that this is an extremely bold claim, right? Because of course, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and this is the reason why this whole debate matters, the reason why we're doing this whole series, is that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his disciples were among the most important and canonical figures in rabbinic and halachic history, right? In other words, they are central to the Tannaitic period. They are the central pillars of Torah Shebaal Peh, and therefore, if this work was in fact written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and in fact written by his disciples, then it should be accorded enormous respect and enormous weight, and should be a central pillar of Jewish theology and Jewish philosophy and halacha, etc. However, if it is in fact written only in the late 13th century by a Kabbalist of not such great, a person of not such great note, Moshe de Leon and others, then it doesn't need to have necessarily such a heavy canonical weight. So you receive this, exactly, Dmin Akos receives this text, and he sets about trying to find out who truly wrote this. So he gets on a ship and travels to Spain, and he meets with Moshe de Leon himself, and you asked Leon, did you write this? He said, yes, I copied it out of an ancient manuscript all the way back from Shir Bar Yochai, and you are welcome to come come visit me in a few months' time. Set a certain date, come visit me in my home in Avila, I think it was, and I will show you. I'll show you this manuscript. So Yitzchak Minachot does that. He waits and he goes to visit Moshe de Leon. Unfortunately, by the time he reaches Moshe de Leon in about the year 1305, Moshe de Leon has died, and only his widow is there. And Yitzchak Minachot comes along with a fellow traveler of his, comes up with an idea to basically offer a generous financial settlement to Moshe de Leon's widow to offer to set her up, and with wealth and with basically to secure her future in return for that manuscript. Because of course, if this is a true manuscript, all the way back, secret hidden manuscript, all the way back from Rishon Bar Yochai, this is priceless. It's the most precious artifact in the world, essentially. And he offers the widow to buy this offer to set her up in return for this manuscript. And the widow turns around to him and says, "I'm sorry, Mr. Dmin Akko, but this manuscript that you are talking of does not exist. I asked my husband about the manuscript, and he says, no, I'm not copying of anything. I'm writing it from my own mind. I'm essentially making it up." And then the widow says, I asked him, why did you make it up? And he said, well, if I would have said I'm writing it, so no one wants to buy it, this wouldn't have much credence, it wouldn't be worth anything. However, if I say this is from Rishon Bar Yochai, people will buy it, people will consider it valuable. And Moshe de Leon's daughter confirmed this evidence by Moshe de Leon's wife, and that's it. And there is where the recollection ends, a bit tantalizingly, because Yitzhak ben Akko says he was going to investigate it further, and it's cut off there. Yeah, go on, Achi.
I do want to jump in and talk a little bit about the story from the text, and also to clarify a little bit, because it is interesting. One little part is that Yitzchak ben Akko himself didn't meet the wife. He met someone else whose wife met the wife.
Yeah, of course. They're very prudish in those days. So he did it through the wife of his friend. So the wife met the wife.
Which is important, because it's a wife of a wife, and not to downplay how it came about. So first of all, he himself says, and by the way, I did cover, it was the Constantinople 1566 is the first one. That's where it is. After that, it's censored out of the Sefer Yochanan.
I see. Okay.
So he does say himself how he came, and what you said, etc. Then he says he came to somebody else, Reb David the Pancorbo, who Pancorbo tells him, just to kind of paraphrase or translate, read him. He says he talked to him, and he says they argue, and he's already telling us, they're different, everyone's saying different things, whether it's really Rashbi or not. So this is already a conversation that's going on in the streets from those that know. But Moshe asked me, no, he swore to me, but I didn't see it, he died. He tells him, I don't know how to believe, I don't know who to speak to. And he says, Pancorbo tells him, there's no question in the world, never came to him. This is made up. Pancorbo tells him, no way. Pancorbo says, no, he wrote the whole thing. That's what he tells him.
Right.
He says, what should I do? Dakar, Moshe Zel, I'm a father God, Moitzi Ba'ain Yafim and Moine, Acha Yoim Azeh, Basi Moli Kazavizov, Shinasal Ashirim, Amivina Beside, they gave him much money. Eile, Asher Yitalem Ksuvim B'Shem HaKoisiv, it should give him, it's written, Machar Betroik Kuloi, Nisroik Kuloi, Acha Ozav Ishto Bitoi, Hina Arumis, Shrias Barav, with some, but Iram Chesuk left him, with nothing. Shemano Shemes Beir Arabilo, but Akov Elech Al Ashir Agadol Asher Beira, this is what you were saying. Goes to the Ashir. Hanik Rabbi Yosef Diavila. And he tells him, He tells him, basically you're saying, I want to, what's going on? But he gives him the Eitzah. Rabbi Yosef should call his wife. Tells her, send it, like we're saying, through the wife. And tell Ramesha's wife, Dad, you should know, I want to marry you off your daughter, living to my son. They'll never be lacking for anything. I'm a rich guy. I only want one thing. I don't want anything else. I want that copy, that manuscript of the Zohar that your husband, Ramesha, was busy copying over. That's what I want. Tell them, let's see what happens. Let's see this trick. The wife of Rabbi Yosef answers, she swore to the wife of this Rabbi Yosef, saying, if ever was with my husband, he made up the entire thing. When I saw him writing it, I said, why are you saying that you're copying from the Sefer Zohar? You're writing from your head. Isn't it better for you to say, wow, look at this amazing work that you wrote down? He told me, if I were told the secret from my head, nobody would listen, no one would give any money for it. He came from his heart. From him. I'm quoting from the Shimba Yechoy who said Baruch HaKodesh, they'll pay a lot of money, it's like your eyes will see. And then he spoke to the daughter, that the mother said, Lechem is similar, but exactly what the mother said. Is there any greater edus? He said, I was quiet. And that's what he says. At this point, this is what basically Menachem believed. The estimate of Avil Talabria, he came to another city of Emtso Bachacham Gadol, Mufla, another found Rabbi Yosef Halevi, son of Rabbi Tudris, the famous Makubal. He told me, and he told him basically it was. And it goes on. And basically, we're missing the end of the testimony, but we know Rabbi Menachem does become a firm believer. So he does, despite, I think it's worth pointing out that Rabbi Menachem, despite this testimony that ends up being censored out of the Sefer Yochsin, does become a believer in the Sefer Zohar, being of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. This we know from his works. That's definitely the case. And again, just to clarify that again, so it was the wife through the wife that he heard from the story. But this is the testimony that he's saying, and clearly what you see with Menachem as well is this was word on the street. This was conversation. Is it Rabbi Shimon Yochai? Is it not Rabbi Shimon Yochai? They were discussing this at the time in Spain.
Right. So I see that my attempt to summarize the story did not find favor in your eyes, and you decided to read the whole thing out, which is fair. No, it's an important text, and I'm happy you read it out loud.
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say also that I read it out. I think the listeners should be able to hear. And by the way, listeners should read it, and they should read it out, and they should
read
the actual text. And I think just to clarify that part a little bit. And by the way, this is my loose translation that I was giving, and there's more to the story a little bit before I started reading and a little bit after. But it's worth just reading it, I think, inside and hearing it a little bit. Not to go after you. I just wanted to clarify that little part and to read a little bit more for the listener.
So as I was in the middle of saying, we have this piece of historical evidence from Yitzhak Menachem, and again, which describes it. Now, the question is, and this is the golden, because this, as you mentioned, this is actually a very important piece of historical evidence for the simple reason that it displays that the very years that the Zohar was being distributed, still in the lifetime of Moshe de Leon, a debate was happening, as you say, on the streets, as it were, among those in the know, among the Yod Echein, whether this was genuine or not. This was a subject for debate. And Yitzhak Menachem came and tried to investigate this, and you are correct that later on in his life he did seem to accept that it was a genuine from Shimon Bar Yochai. However, we have this seemingly first-hand evidence from Yitzhak Menachem, from his diaries, that the wife and daughter of Moshe de Leon swore that he actually made it up for himself. Now, question becomes, how good a piece of historical evidence is this? And the answer is yes and no, good and bad, right? For the simple reason that, firstly, this is from a journal transcribed a couple hundred years later, put into Sefer Yochasin. We also don't really know how much to trust the wife and daughter of Rav Moshe de Leon. How much did Rav Moshe de Leon tell them? And for example, in his introduction to the Zohar, the introduction to the Zohar by Arthur Green writes that in his opinion, this sounds like the sort of thing a man would say basically to blow off his wife and to get her to stop bothering him, right? In other words, why are you copying that? Oh, no, I'm just making it up, right? It has, according to Arthur Green, has possibly the ring of inauthenticity, not that the evidence is inauthentic, but rather this depends on A, Rav Moshe de Leon's wife and daughter faithfully recording what Rav Moshe de Leon said, and B, Rav Moshe de Leon telling his wife what he really thought, right? Which is also not, or telling her the truth, which again, could or could not be. So in terms of historical evidence, it is intriguing. It is very important that we have that first-hand evidence. It does show that immediately there was debate about it at the time, but I wouldn't say it's conclusive. In any way, shape, or form. But it's important to know. So that is the testimony of Yitzhak Tamin Akko already, again, very early on, still while Rav Moshe de Leon was still alive in the early 1300s. Okay, so that is so that's that. Now, as I said before, there were some like Menachem Rekanati, like Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher, who seem to accept quite early on that what they are receiving is in fact the words, the direct composition of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. However, quite early on, there already appear to be some objections. So, for example, one of them is a Kabbalist from the 14th century, in the 1300s. We have a man called Yosef ibn Wakar. Not much is known about him. We do have a book written by him called Shorshei HaKabbalah. He seems to have been a respected Kabbalist. And in Shorshei HaKabbalah, he was a serious Kabbalist. He gives a whole list of books that are important for every Mekubal to read, right? And he talks about the Sefer Bahir, and he talks about the Sefer Yetzirah, and he talks about the Pirush Ramban al HaTorah, which we probably should have mentioned earlier a little bit, actually, which is that the Ramban seems to have been a pre-Zoharic Kabbalist. However, all that we know about the Ramban's Kabbalah seems to come from his Talmidim and the Talmidim of his Talmidim. Why? Because he himself wrote only very much in delicate hints, right? If you open the Pirush Ramban al Torah, you find, occasional comments al derech ha'emet and then a cryptic sentence or two. And so we know that he was in possession of some kind of esoteric doctrine or lore, and he was certainly relied upon by later Kabbalists as a great authority. But nonetheless, anyway, so this, so the Ramban, the writings of the Ramban become also, a source of Kabbalistic doctrine by later Kabbalists. So anyway, so within this book by Yosef ibn Wakar, Shorshei HaKabbalah, he mentions all these books. However, he then says, and there is this other book called the Zohar, and you shouldn't read it. It's not reliable. It's not old. And basically, within a few sentences, he says that this is not a genuine Kabbalistic book. This is not something which should be included in the great books of Kabbalah. This is not conclusive one way or another, but it does show that within the circles of Kabbalists, already in those early days, you did have some who accepted, and you also had some who dismissed the Zohar, who said, no, this isn't what it claims to be. That's the evidence we have from that. Now, there was also evidence from these early centuries. Again, this is before it's printed. This is before it becomes popularized. This is before it goes on the bookshelf of every base medrash and every shul everywhere. This is still while circulating manuscript form. There are those who object not so much to the claim that it's written by Rishon Bar Yochai, but basically to the doctrines of the Zohar, the central doctrines of the Zohar. And the most famous example of this is the Shut Rivash. Okay, now the Shut Rivash is very well known among anyone who's been to yeshiva, etc. Yitzhak Bar Sheshet Parfet in the 14th century, and he has an extraordinary extraordinary piece in his the Shut Rivash Kuf Nun Zayin, where basically he begins to take issue with one of the major claims of the Kabbalists, of the Zoharic Kabbalists, which is that of the Sfirot, and specifically, he has an issue with their claim that during Tefillah, while you're davening, you should aim your different requests, different bakashot, to different Sfirot, right? So when you're saying this paragraph, you should have in mind this Sfirah. And when you're saying this paragraph, you have in mind that Sfirah. And basically, I'm going to read a little bit from the actual Shut of the Rivash, because it's a very important source of Zohar, I would call Zohar or Kabbalistic skepticism, from someone who lived in the same time as the Talmidim of the Ramban and the Talmidim of the Rashba, etc., and people who really were pushing this. But you have the Rivash who's expressing serious skepticism. So this is from Kuf Nun Zayin. So a little bit down, he says, "Gam b'tfilat Shmona Esrei yesh lahem b'chol achat v'achat kavana l'sfira yedua." Right. So as I mentioned before, one of their doctrines is that in all your tefillas, with different bakashot, different brachot, you aim them, you direct them towards a different specific sfira. And then he says the following. V'chol zeh hu davar zar me'od be'enai. This is very strange to me. Mi she'eino mekubal kamohem v'choshvim shezeh emunat shniyut. Right? This seems to me, he says, this is very, very strange, and even emunat shniyut, which basically means polytheism, it's an emunah of multiple divinities, almost, right? And then he says, "V'kvar shamati echad min hamitpalsafim," and I already heard from one of the mitpalsafim, one of the philosophically inclined. He doesn't say who, sort of a philosophically inclined contemporary, misaper begnut hamukubalim, who talks, who disparages the Kabbalists. V'hu omer she ha'ovdei gilulim ma'aminei hashilush. Right? It basically says that those idolaters, i.e. the Christians, they believe in a shilush, they believe in the Trinity, a three-part God, and the Kabbalists believe in a asiriyut, in a 10-part God. In other words, if you believe in a God which comprised, that contained within the divinity is a 10-part, or 10 facets, or 10 aspects, or 10 powers, or however exactly you want to define the spherat, that seems to be idolatrous, that seems to be polytheistic. You are essentially praying to a God with many different faculties and many different elements. And he's saying, how is that different from the Christians? The Christians believe in a God of three, that 3 is 1 and 1 is 3. And the Kabbalists seem to believe that 1 is 10 and 10 is 1. Now, this claim echoes a letter written by Avraham Abulafia, who was one of the great Kabbalists of the 13th century, but not a Zoharic Kabbalist. And he and the Rashba, the famous Rashba, have quite an acerbic back and forth, accusing each other of all sorts of things. And one of the things that that Abulafia, who was a non-Zoharic Kabbalist, a Kabbalist of quite a different stream, he basically turned around and accused the Rashba of exactly this. He says that you who believe in the Sfirot, you have taken God and divided him into 10, and the Christians believe in a 3-part God, and you believe in a 10-part God. That's what Abulafia wrote to the Rashba, and that's what the Rivash is accusing here in the name of Echad Hamit Palsafim, one of the philosophically minded people. But he's basically quoting this seemingly approvingly about the Zoharic Kabbalists. Now, so what does he do? What does the Rivash do? He goes and consults with a well-known Talmud Chacham and Mukubal and asks him this question. And basically this Mukubal turns to the Rivash and says, no, you have it wrong. He says, no, we don't believe that God has 10 parts. This isn't idolatry. This isn't polytheism or anything of the sort. What is this? He says, Mashal Maladavad Omer, to a king who has many ministers. And basically when he receives a request, so he delegates it to various ministers, right? So if you need something from the king, you need a loan of money from the king, then he'll answer you through his secretary of the treasury or chancellor of the exchequer. If you need military assistance, so you'll go through his Ramatkal, right? If you need, depending on what the request is, it will go through the royal administration differently. And that is, according to this particular Mukubal, that is what is meant by the SSC. Not that they represent different parts of God, but what it means is that they represent rather different manners through which God Himself answers prayer. Something like that was the mashal given by this Mukubal to the Rivash. Now the Rivash accepts this partially, and he says the following. This is the brilliance of this Rivash, because it doesn't just accept this response of the Kabbalist. It expresses a certain amount of skepticism, and he goes on to say the following. Amnam, however, this is towards the end of this particular tshuva, says, Amnam, mi machnis otanu b'chol zeh. Who entered us into all this? Who invited us to believe all this? Right? Halo tov lehitpalel stam l'Hashem yitbarach. Surely it's just better just to daven to Hashem. B'chavana, v'hu yodea be'ez derech yashlim hamevukash. And he will know how best to respond to the tefillah. And Kamar HaKatov, he quotes various psukim. V'chein, and therefore, hodaticha masha amar elai b'yichud mori harav Rabbeinu Nisim. So he quotes the Ran Zal, who says, Ki harbe yoter midai takua atzmo haramban Zal la'amin ba'inyan ha'kabbalah ha'hi. This is an extraordinary quote. This is an amazing quote. The Rivash is quoting the Ran, who said to him, the Ramban was much too takua. He was mired. He was stuck in this whole Kabbalistic business. And I choose not, there's a reverse saying, I choose not to mire myself in the same discipline, because I didn't receive it from a mukubal, from someone who was part of this tradition. So, firstly, it's an extraordinary idea that the Ran should say about the Ramban was too much into Kabbalah. That's an amazing thing to say. Amazing evidence from the Rivash, quoting the Ran, saying that one of the great masters of the Kabbalah was too much into, was takua. That's the first thing. And the second thing why I love this last part of the Rivash is that it expresses a certain kind of Kabbalah skepticism, which doesn't necessarily deny the Kabbalah, doesn't necessarily say it's illegitimate, but it says, Mi machnis otanu b'chol zeh. Who invited us into this? Who asked us to believe this? We, meaning non-Kabbalistic sources of Judaism, already have a satisfactory theology. There's a God, you pray to him, he answers you in some form or other, and that's it. And that's all you need to know. That's all we need. Who decided that we need a 10-stage series of emanations, each of which represent a certain power of God, and to each of which we need to, when we're davening Shemona Esrei, we need to direct our words to different parts, different elements of the divine administrative structure, as it were, and expect an answer through this. Who asked us to do this? And this, to me, is a very interesting example of a certain kind of Zohar skepticism, which doesn't necessarily, this Shut Rivash doesn't say a word about the authorship of the Zohar, because it does say and does show evidence of a kind of wariness, a kind of skepticism on the part of some of the great figures of the 14th century, immediately after the publication and dissemination of the Zohar, to some of its central doctrines. And this is an important part of the Zoharic story, to my mind. Yeah, go on.
No, it definitely is, and that's it. Listen, it's definitely worth explaining and talking about those, and of course, as we've mentioned, those that definitely accepted. You mentioned Rabbi Nachum Rekanati, who is commentary on the Torah, and he is quoting it extensively, Rabbi Bachya, and many others. There are others as well that accepted early on. And I think we've mentioned Shaya Tishbi's introduction to Mishnah Zohar, whether that's in Hebrew or the English translation, is really excellent. He really goes through, he delves in much more. He talks about the different names of the Zohars called early on, as I mentioned some of that before, and he talks about those that accepted it, those that didn't. He gives that rundown. But those that are accepting it, I say they're not going into this question. The Rekanati doesn't go into this question. He's just accepting the Zohar as Rashbi, and he's just talking about it. And he's quoting it extensively and using it extensively.
So I should probably interrupt at this point and say that yes, for those who want to chase up this history of Kabbalah criticism, there are three important sources I think you should take a look at. The first one is, as you mentioned, Mishnat HaZohar, a great work on the Zohar by Shaya Tishbi, who was an Israeli scholar of Kabbalah in the mid-20th century, and that's been translated into English as The Wisdom of the Zohar, and translated and published by Lippmann Library in the 80s. And that introduction has a good outline. The second is a chapter by Boaz Hus in this book called Zohar Reception and Impact, also by Lippmann Library. That has a good chapter. Again, both of these chapters are good, but they're missing parts and they're also not so satisfactory. That's why I'm trying to fill up some of the gaps here. And they are, yes, that's also a very useful chapter. And the third source, which I think also should be read by anyone interested in this, is an essay in Hebrew by Mark Shapiro, published in Milin Chavivin. And the title is something like, Ha'im yesh chiyuv laha'amin b'sefer HaZohar, or something like that. Basically, the question there poses the question of is it heretical? Or did rabbinic authorities consider it apikarsus, not to believe in the Zohar and to deny the antiquity and deny the centrality of the Zohar? That's also a very good source. It mainly deals with the modern period, less the pre-modern period, but still, it's chock full of excellent sources, as are all the essays by Mark Shapiro, and always good fun. So I strongly recommend to read that as well. Of course, his name in Hebrew is Melech Shapiro, which threw me off for a while. I didn't actually know who that was, but eventually I figured that out. Okay, so those are the three major sources. Now, the last part of this particular episode I want to deal with is the first great example of a work explicitly denying and pointing out the flaws in the theory of the attribution of the Zohar to Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. And that's the first major example of explicit Zohar criticism, which is the book Bechinat Hadat, written by an Italian philosopher called Eliyahu del Medigo, who died in 1493. He was born on the island of Crete, lived much of his life wandering around in Italy and Germany. He was actually a great philosopher, so to speak, a secular philosopher. Even though he was a Talmud Chacham and a religious Jew, etc., but he was one of these early Italian sort of Renaissance philosophers, known as a great defender of Aristotle, of also an interpreter of Averroes, the Islamic philosopher, a great defender and interpreter of the Rambam, and he had friends among the Italian humanists who we'll talk about a little bit in the next episode, Pico della Mirandola and others, and he was a serious player in the philosophical scene in the mid to late 15th century in the Italian peninsula. And the reason why this is actually an important book, I mean, firstly, it introduces many of the anti-Zoharic arguments for the first time, but also it is an excellent example of Zohar criticism before Girush Sfarad, before the expulsion from Spain, because that heralded a whole new chapter in the history of the Zohar, a whole new chapter in the history of Zohar criticism as well. And so this is really the only example that we have a sort of systematic critique before the Girush Sfarad and the pre-printing, pre-expulsion era. So he wrote this book, B'chinat Hadat. It's actually a very short book. Anyone can get through it in a couple of hours. It's written in quite nice Hebrew as well, as was the style of the humanists. They wrote, they had a strong tradition of rhetoric, of expressing themselves very nicely. And it's a book that generally defends a philosophically sophisticated or a form of Judaism that is that is enriched by the world's philosophical traditions, especially the tradition of Aristotle. Now, what's interesting is that by the late 1400s, Jewish Aristotelianism was essentially on its deathbed, right? In other words, early figures such as the Rambam, such as the Ralbag, and others had strongly defended forms of Judaism that frameworks of Jewish philosophy that were nourished very much or were in conversation with Aristotelian philosophy, which is of course all the rage in the high Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages among Christians and Muslim philosophers. However, by the time that Eliyahu Domego was writing in the late 1400s, this was very much out of fashion and going on his deathbed. And basically, after Girush Sfarad, you don't really hear much more of any other. Firstly, Jewish rationalist philosophy in general dies, but certainly Jewish Aristotelianism dies along with it. Now, this book, B'chinat Hadat, in the course of defending a rational and philosophically inclined form of Judaism, he starts to talk about Kabbalah and specifically talk about the Zohar. And according to Eliyahu Domenico, there were two sets of issues or two categories of problems with the Zohar: philosophical and historical. And he starts to set the table and set the table, which will of course be taken up by many later thinkers and many later critics of the Zohar and the critics of the critics. So, firstly, there are a couple of issues, philosophical issues. The first one is, as I mentioned before, this notion of the Sphira, the notion of that within the divinity, within the divine ecosystem, within the divine being or entities or realms, however exactly you want to describe it, there was a plurality, right? There was a 10-part stage. Now, I'm going to go on a little bit of a divergence here because there is a lively debate among early Kabbalists about whether the 10 Sphirot are Kelim or Atzmut, whether they are created beings, in other words, Kelim, created by God, or whether they are, in fact, Atzmut, whether they are, in fact, part of God himself, right? And the problem is that whichever way you go, whichever part of the debate whichever side you endorse, you run into problems. Not to say these problems are insurmountable, but you run into problems. What are the problems? Well, if you say they are Atzmut, if you say they are part of God himself, those 10 spheres are, in fact, inherent within the divine itself and are not created, well, then you have a bit of a problem because then you say, well, that seems to be a God that has many parts to him, right? That seems to be a many-sided being rather than one unified God, right? How can God be one? How can we say Hashem Echad if there are, in fact, an Asiriyut, as the Rivash put it, a 10-part stage within God? So that's one issue. And if you choose the other side, if you say they are, in fact, Kelim, they are created entities into which God, the divine light pours, or however exactly you want to say it, then you say, well, how can we pray to them? Right? Because, of course, part of the Kabbalistic doctrine, as mentioned earlier, is that you direct the kavanah of some of your tefillot to these sfirot. Well, then how can you pray to created entities? These aren't part of God, and therefore, anytime you try and pray to them, you will have. That falls afoul of one of the Rambam's Ikarim of not praying to any intermediaries, not praying to any entities that lie between the human being and God. So anyway. So that's what you have. So that is the first philosophical issue that this sort of multifaceted depiction of God, right, which in Delmedigo's eyes runs afoul of the principle of divine unity. And the other much greater issue for Delmedigo was the issue of theurgy. Now, theurgy means the ability of human beings to affect the divine realms. Because, of course, the doctrine of the Sfirot isn't only that there exists this 10-part element to God, but rather that human beings have a role to play in the correct balancing of these 10 divine energies, as you were. Because those who write about 10 Sfirot say not only that they exist, but rather they exist in delicate relationship with each other, and that human beings, by when they sin, they cause rupture, they cause shever among these 10, in and among these 10 Sfirot, and by doing good things, they affect a tikkun, they affect a restitution, a rectification of these essence Sfirot, and therefore human beings are granted an enormous amount of power, right? They have great theurgic power to affect positively or negatively the divine realms. Now, for a pure Aristotelian philosopher like Elijah Delmedigo, this is nonsense. How can human beings possibly affect the divine realms? God is perfect. God is completely unified. The idea from the Maimonidean philosophical perspective, the idea that human beings have the power to fix or break or do anything to the divine realms is nonsense. What do you mean? God is perfect. God is unified. God is exactly as he always was and exactly as he will be, and he's utterly immutable and unchangeable. This idea that we have the power to affect it one way or another is, in their eyes, nonsense. Okay? And therefore, and that's the second, so according to Elijah Delmedigo, the Zohar is objectionable, firstly, because philosophically it's objectionable. How can God have 10 parts to him? And how can human beings possibly affect, positively or negatively, the divine realm? That is sort of the philosophical objections. But actually, more interestingly, is the historical objections that Elijah Delmedigo brings up. And this is the first time that these objections are voiced, really, and they'll be developed in much greater length by later commentators. So the historical issues, as they are, that are brought up by Delmedigo, go as follows. The firstly is the complete lack of reference to the Zohar in any Jewish literature prior to the Zohar. Okay? So this is what I call the problem of the gap. The problem of the gap is that theoretically this book was composed by Rav Shimon Bar Yochai and his Talmidim in the 2nd century of the Common Era. It was only brought to the attention of the world in the late 13th century. So you have about 1,100 years, more than 1,100 years, in which this book ostensibly exists. People ostensibly know about it. It travels at least among small groups, and yet it is never mentioned, not in the Mishnah, and not in the Medrash, and not in the Talmud, Bavli Yerushalmi, and not among the Gaonim, and not among the early Rishonim, and not by the Rambam, and not by anyone. Nobody heard of it, nobody talks about it, nobody mentions it, nobody speaks about its doctrines, nobody, makes even sly or esoteric references to it. It has 1,100 years of complete and total and utter silence. Okay, that is the first historical objection. Now, of course, the counterpoint to this, and we're going to discuss this at length, but the counterpoint to this, of course, is that, obviously it's a secret, it's a sod, it's an esoteric doctrine, and therefore nobody wrote about it. And the counter objection to that is, but, can people really keep a secret for 1,100 years that perfectly, that well? It's never referenced, it's never brought up, nobody ever heard of it or talked about it at all for 1,100 years. Is that possible? So that is the first historical issue that's brought up by Elijah Delmedigo. The second issue is that the Zohar seems to reference various figures that lived later than Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. In fact, it talks about certain Amoraim, such as Rav Chia and Rav Abba and others, and various other figures who they're called Rav. And of course, Rav is only a title applied to Rabbanim who live in Bavel, not in Eretz Yisrael, right? So how can it be that figures who lived centuries after Rav Shimon Bar Yochai are already mentioned in the Zohar? How does that work, right? That is another problem brought up in Bichret Hadat. And another issue, the third issue, is the relationship between Zohar and specifically Rav Shimon Bar Yochai and Halacha. Right? And there are many sides to this issue, but the issue brought up in that is, surely if Rav Shimon Bar Yochai knew the Torah Tasod, if he knew all the secrets of the Torah and believed that the Kabbalistic doctrines that he was teaching, were the true, deepest core of true interpretation of the meaning of the Torah, of the meaning of the biblical text, then surely the halacha would be like him. Surely he would know, he would have, superior access granted to halachic insight, and therefore, by dint of that, surely his opinion should be recognized as the halacha. And of course, as we know, those of us who learn the Mishnah and learn the Gemara, that's not the case. That sometimes the halacha is not like Rosh Bar Yochai, and therefore, how can that be? If Rosh Bar Yochai really was this great possessor of Torah secrets, surely he should be recognized as such, and surely part of that recognition would be that his words would be given greater weight within the halakhic tradition, and this is not so. This is not the case. There are other issues, and the relationship between Zohar and halakha is a very rich one. We're going to come to it more later, but this is the major issue posited by Eliyahu Del Medigo. So, and again, this is the first attempt, the first criticism of the Zohar, in a sort of in a systematized manner. It doesn't cover all the objections to the Zohar, but it covers a few of the major ones. It covers the problem of apparent, I would say, polytheism, or let's say very daring and potentially objectionable theological doctrines within the Zohar. It covers the issue of theurgy. Is it really true? Is it really the case that human beings can affect and rectify the divine realms? Problem number 2. And then some of the historical issues, which is anachronisms, things that are later in the Zohar that are in fact mentioned in the Zohar. How can it be that Amoraim are mentioned by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and talk to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and talk to Rabbi Elazar his son? How can that possibly be? How can it possibly be that the Zohar is never mentioned by anyone, that it remains a perfect 1100-year silence from the time it is ostensibly written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai until Rav Moshe de Leon? And finally, why is it not followed halachically? Why is the Zohar not a centerpiece of the halachic canon? There are many halachot given in the Zohar, some of which we don't follow. And why isn't Rav Shimon Bar Yochai seen as the greatest halachic authority, given that he knows ostensibly the Sitrei Torah? That is Aregel Achat, the criticism of the Zohar in this case. And with that comes to an end the Girush Sfarad, the pre-expulsion from Spain era of the Zohar, in which again it is spreading slowly and sort of in secret and among Kabbalistic circles these various sort of pamphlets, these various doctrinal texts, which eventually come to be known as the Zohar. And there are some who accept it straight away, some who seem to reject it. We have this interesting historical evidence from Yitzhak Min Akko, later on transcribed the Sefer Yochasin, and we have the philosophical and historical objections, or at least the seedlings of these objections, given by Eliyahu Del Medigo in Bechinat Hadat, published a year before 1492.
Yeah, so in Bechinat Hadat, we're going to get to later the comments of his. We're not sure how he's related, but Yasher Mikandia, Yasser Shlomo Del Medigo, and how he publishes it as well in his Matzah L'Chachma, and then there's actually an edition.
Yes, we're getting that. And
no, that's for the next episode.
Hold your fire. We're getting that.
I'm just mentioning it, and then Bechinas Hadas is also published later by the Maskil Yasher Shmuel Regio, and he published it with an extensive commentary as well. And then there's an academic edition now. But all these, these farm, that's the first sefer. I guess I'll mention as we go through them the different editions of them, so you can find those editions. It's actually the new edition was Tel Aviv University Press, and they actually reissued it again a couple of years ago. Critical edition based on manuscripts and different things like that. So there's
Oh, sure, 100%. It is. You're right. What I should have mentioned a little bit behind that is that, because it was written pre-printing, so only circled in manuscript and didn't have a great effect on it, or wasn't widely read, wasn't widely quoted until it was published in 1629 by the descendant, and then it only had a much bigger effect when it was republished in 1833 at the height of the Haskalah, the late Hebraic Eastern European Haskalah, and yes, that is an important part of Bechinat Hadat, which had much greater effect many centuries after the death of its author.
Because as often happened those times, and this has come up on other episodes of the podcast, when we talk about there's culture, print culture and book culture, and what happens is now we're just used to having books published, but at those times there were manuscripts, and you'd write a manuscript, it would be copied, X amount of copies, it would circulate around, this just in broad strokes. But even after book publishing was a thing, even at that time there was some books being published, manuscripts still continued for centuries. There were still books that circulated in manuscript. Ari Noam, we'll get to him. That's one of them that just circulates in manuscript for many, many years and centuries before it's actually printed. And as you say, eventually, so Yasher Mikandi, we'll get your next episode, publishes this in 1629, and then we know it's published again with a commentary, as I mentioned, by Yasher Shmuel Regio, and Regio being a Maskil, and again, that's another thing we'll get to later, the Haskalah rediscovering these anti-Zohar, anti-Kabbalah texts and taking them and running with them. But another thing worth mentioning that I mentioned just to emphasize that we've gone through a number of these works that are quote unquote attacking the Zohar, authenticity of the Zohar, Rishon Bar Yochai being the Zohar. And the reason for not mentioning the other side, if those listeners are wondering, well, where's the other side? Because there isn't really much of another side, right? The other side is
Yet.
Correct. We're going to get to. There are real.
We'll get that.
But at this point, it's like we said, there's those that just accept it. The Rishon Bar Yochai wrote the Zohar. That's it, right? We saw that the earlier comments, but there isn't a lot of defending it and coming out with full scale defenses yet of it. It's just accepting it as Rishon Bar Yochai, and so there isn't much to say. There's obviously most. I think it's fair to say most Svarim, most Gedolim, most Rishonim at this time accepted it as Rishon Bar Yochai. Lack of evidence, because the lack of evidence, and some they actually quoted as Rishon Bar Yochai according to Zohar. So it's of the two. There's not much to say there, other than these are the Svarim, these are those that are coming out and saying, wait, hold on, there's an issue. And so we're going to get to where the issues come later, and then the defenses come.
Correct.
But now you can get to Gerus Sfarad. I know you wanted to talk about the role that the Gerus Sfarad played in expanding and the Zohar.
I certainly do, but that shall have to wait for the next episode.
Yeah, we'll start the next episode with that. That's an important thing. So with that, that's the end of this is the first episode in the series on the reception of the Zohar, and hopefully listeners found it interesting. In the show's notes, I will link to some of the stuff and not link to everything. I'll try to put a full suggested reading list on the WhatsApp community, but I'll try to link to some things in the show's notes. Some of the primary texts are available in HebrewBooks.org. You can download them, whether the Yashar Mekandia, and I've mentioned the Bechinis Hadas with Regio. You can also I'll also link, we mentioned Boaz Hossa's book in English, the Mishnas Hazar in English, the Mishnas Hazar in Hebrew is Bialik. It's available. I don't know about it in America, but it's definitely available. You can get that introduction. And then there are some other general introductions there. You mentioned Arthur Green's book. I'll post. There's also, like I mentioned, the Zohar. So the Hamor Zohar, you can't buy the first volume standalone, but there's this massive Zohar they've done. They have an intro. I know that the Masik Midvash Zohar, it's not in the Zohar. He has a separate, I think it's called Sharei Zohar. He has a separate volume that he goes through some of this. You can read some of this material in there, and there's more. So I'll try to link to some of this information in the show's notes that those interested can check out. And thank you, JJ, for joining me on the first episode, and looking forward to the next episode.
Pleasure as always, Nachil. See you next time.